Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. Welcome to today's session on reshaping your one-shot instruction, applying pedagogical theory to practice. My name is Amy Pajewski, and I'm the Student Success Librarian at Westchester University. And joining me is Rachel McMullin, who is our Humanities Librarian, also at Westchester University.
Okay, so let's jump into what we have planned for today. First of all, we are going to sort of talk through the process that we've developed for applying pedagogy or UDL to the one-shot, and we're going to use universal design for learning as our main example for that, and that'll probably take 15 or 20 minutes. And then because we propose this as a roundtable, not expecting there to be nearly as many people as have shown up, so a whole group discussion isn't going to work. So then we have a guided activity, and we're going to break people into breakout rooms, and Amy and I are going to do our best to jump into all of them so that we can sort of work through this together as a group. And then whatever time we have left at the end, we're going to come back together so that we can reflect, discuss, maybe report on how people did. We also on this slide have our learning outcomes, and I'll let Amy really quickly go over those.
Sure. So after this session, we're really hoping that you'll be able to identify a pedagogical theory that you've been wanting to use in your classroom, and hopefully break down that theory into its applicable parts. So taking a large theory, breaking it down into its pieces, and then finally being able to develop strategies for applying that pedagogy into your practice, hopefully as soon as you leave here today.
Okay, so this slide exists just because I mentioned we're using universal design for learning as our main example. So I want to make sure everybody has the brief background on what that is. So universal design for learning is a theory that tries to make learning more accessible for all students by providing multiple ways for the students to feel engaged or connected with the learning, multiple ways of presenting information, and multiple ways for students to show what they have learned. So now that we've hit that, we're going to sort of jump into the process. Now note that Amy and I put these in as bullet points rather than number order, because this is a situation where you could go in this order, you could flip it around a little bit, or sometimes you might even skip some of the steps. So the first step is that you do have to acknowledge and accept that if you teach one-shots, it does limit what you can do, both in general and especially if applying a specific theory or pedagogy to your work. And this can be frustrating for us as teachers. And some of you might be asking yourself, well, why should I even bother to go through this whole process if I can't do it, quote unquote, the right way? Well, Amy and I really feel that when you make even small changes to your teaching, it is in fact impactful. And if you applying a new pedagogy or theory allows something to resonate or connect with even a handful of students in a given class, then it is worthwhile for you to do that. Amy, do you have anything to add to the why?
Yeah, in addition to what Rachel said, I think it's really important to monitor yourself. We're teaching a lot of one-shot sessions all the time, and burnout is so common. And so I think one way to kind of stave off the burnout is really to think about, like, what are some ways that I can push myself, against my comfort zone and try something new. Now, I'm not saying we need to jump in headfirst and really get into like exposure therapy or something, but just kind of pushing the boundaries of our own comfort zone is going to allow us to grow as teachers and to try something new to keep that burnout sort of out of our sights.
Okay, and then so the next step, we have a couple of questions for you to think about sort of at the same time. And one is, if you're looking at a theory, why does it appeal to you? And then second of all, also think about if it's compatible with your style. So I'm going to move away from UDL for a second and think about critical pedagogy, which I'm really sorry I missed what I hear was a fantastic presentation on that yesterday. So critical pedagogy is really concerned with structural inequality and social justice. And it does appeal to me as a pedagogy, because I think that's the sort of thing college students need to be learning about. But when I start to look at it in terms of what I teach, it's not necessarily a great fit. So a lot of my classes tend to focus on strategic searching and research as process. And it's not very often that I get into things like authority or information has value, which are actually parts of the framework that I think sort of resonate or align better with critical pedagogy as an approach. And also, I have to admit, as a teacher, when I think about trying to address controversial topics in a one-shot format, that makes me awful nervous and uncomfortable. So I just don't know if it's a good fit for me. But on the other hand, UDL also really resonates with me. But when I started sort of getting into the nitty gritty of it, I was like, yes, this is something that I could easily apply across my teaching and feel good about it. So that's why those are two separate questions. We think that also closely aligned with this idea of, how you're going to use the theory is pretty early on. Think about what your outcomes are going to be for employing this theory or pedagogy. And sometimes it might be that you're actually revising existing student learning outcomes or writing a new one because you're actually introducing some new content, something new you want them to learn. But keep in mind, this isn't always the case. So with UDL, I'm not introducing any new content or concepts for them to learn. I'm introducing strategies that I hope will them learn my existing outcomes more easily, so meet those outcomes more in a better way. So I have a personal teaching goal that goes something like use UDL to make small but impactful changes to my teaching to better support student learning. Okay. Now we're sort of moving into the real nitty-gritty, which is thinking about breaking down theory. And we've sort of broken this down into two steps. The first one is to get an overview of the theory or pedagogy and then get real serious about thinking about how to apply that to the one-shot. So I'm going to escape from my full screen for just a second so I can zip over. Sorry, a little technical difficulty there, to the Universal Design for Learning website. Now, I have to say, it's really rare to have a theory or pedagogy that has an official website. So I'm lucky with my example here. But what Amy and I want you to think about is when we say sort of get to know your theory or get an overview, we mean that. Like, we don't want you to get hung up on thinking that you need to become an expert on the theory and that you have to read a whole book and 17 scholarly journal articles before you're allowed to start applying it to your one-shots. So we're saying look for things like Wikipedia pages, blog posts, articles published in professional magazines, or one of my personal favorites, somebody's LibGuide where they go over it. So you're just trying to get a feel for it. And as you start to use it, you'll become more and more familiar over time and you can apply it better and better. But give yourself permission to start small and have a few stumbles. So I have spent a lot of time on this website going through and digging through and really thinking about it. And then the second step is, yes, you need to zero in and be really honest about what you can and cannot do with said pedagogy or theory. So for instance, looking at UDL, you can see here those three categories that I talked about. The middle one is multiple means of representation. And there's some things in there that are very doable, like under language and symbols, clarify vocabulary. Well, that's really important for librarians to either explain our library jargon or maybe preferably even toss it all out and stop using it. Or under comprehension, okay, yeah, supplying background knowledge is something I can do in a one-shot, or especially this one, highlight patterns, critical features, big ideas, and relationships, or as I like to call it, try to make all my connections explicit rather than implicit. I can do that. But like if I move over to the right-hand column in the blue, which is action and expression, this executive function, guide appropriate goal setting, support planning and strategy development, I got 50 minutes most of the time. That stuff probably isn't going to happen for me. So if I go and I look at my overall implementation of Universal Design for Learning across my one-shot instruction, I'd say that probably 75% of the strategies I use fall under the middle category of multiple means of representation. And only maybe 15 to 20% of what I do falls under multiple means of engagement on the left, and probably only 5 to 10% falls under action and expression on the right. So my implementation is completely unbalanced and uneven. And what Amy and I want you to know is we think that is perfectly okay. You are allowed to pick and choose. Just a second while I jump back. So after you've got a decent feel for your theory and you're starting to see how it's going to fit into your one shot, then decide how you are going to apply it in terms of where it's going to go. So some pedagogies like UDL are things that you really can sort of spread all the way across your teaching. But other pedagogies, you're really going to be better off picking like 1 or 2 classes as your starting point. So going back to critical pedagogy, if I were to decide to implement that, I'd say, well, where's going to be the best place for me to start? And I happen to be the librarian for women's and gender studies. So I would probably wait until I had an upper level class in women's and gender studies, because I would feel that the students would probably be familiar with some of the topics I might bring up. And the students, and almost especially the professor, would almost certainly be familiar with critical pedagogy itself as an approach. So it would really resonate and work well with that sort of class. Okay, moving on to the next. So after you've done all of those steps, sort of we're getting towards the end, then the next step is to really generate a lot of ideas. And on this slide, for UDL, I call it strategies. But depending on the theory or pedagogy, it could just be ideas. It could be topics that you would want to address. There could be different ways of doing this, but we want you to brainstorm a lot of stuff. Now, once again, it's perfectly fine at this stage if you want to dig into the literature. Book chapters and scholar journal articles are great places to get ideas for implementation, but don't limit yourself to that. I know sometimes I feel like if I haven't read it in the literature, but thought it up myself, then I second guess myself, like, is that really valid? You have to trust yourself at some point. If you've studied your theory and you come up with an idea, trust that it falls under that theory or pedagogy. And then also, we encourage you to brainstorm more ideas than you could possibly use. So we're thinking of it as a toolkit that you can go back to in the future. I mean, especially I'm sure all of us have had it happen. You get the email from the professor like 2 or 3 days before they want the class, and you really don't want to say no. So imagine if you have this toolkit to go back to full of ideas and strategy that you can grab some stuff really quick. And then the final step is to, from that toolkit, choose the things that are going to work best for you as a teacher. So you can see here, I've highlighted some of the UDL things that I use most frequently. And don't feel pressure to do it in some way just because a colleague might be implementing it that way. So for example, Amy and I both use UDL. And one of the things that we both try to do is to rely a little less on lecture in our session so that we can introduce other ways for students to learn. Now, Amy, on the one hand, loves doing these whole class discussions where she'll like pose questions or do like a little think, pair, share, and then she actually gets the students to talk to her, even when they're freshmen. This always amazes me. And I tried a couple of times to do that myself, and you know what? I suck at it. I'm not comfortable doing that. But the bottom line is I don't have to do that. I can break up my session, my lecture in other ways. We can do an in-class activity like a worksheet. I can break the students into small groups so they're discussing among themselves. Or my personal favorite, in my classes, my students almost always come with their research topic already set before class. So I can talk some and then give them some time to work using the things I've shown them while I circulate and provide extra support to the students who actually need some support in that one-on-one environment. So I'm going to go to this next slide. On this slide, Amy and I put all of the sort of the approach together. Here we did a number order, though, like we said, you don't have to do them in order, just so that you could see all of them together while we take a little pause and see if there are any questions before we move on to the breakout room. So I think, Amy, you've been monitoring the chat. Do we have any questions?
Yes, Laura asked a good question. They said, how do you apply these strategies in asynchronous sessions? I struggle with interactive activities for these types of sessions. So how I would approach that, like, especially with UDL. I think with the asynchronous sessions, one thing you could do very simple is have like an outline of like what students can expect in the asynchronous module. And then you can create some other like activities that go alongside a video or whatever the learning object might be. Rachel, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think that's true. I think, and one thing I'd want to point out was that with all of this, some pedagogies work better with some types of teaching. So some of the pedagogies that we've listed for our small group work really wouldn't work well for asynchronous instruction at all, because they really rely sort of on in-person contact. So part of it might be that you might have to reject an approach because it wouldn't work. I do think that UDL works really pretty well for asynchronous, because there's a lot in there that is about structure, multiple ways of presenting information. So you can look at it and be like, oh, am I doing both visual and words? Could I throw in a video? Can I throw in another way to learn something? And that can really be part of it. But that is part of the whole process of like really looking at something. And if it's just going to be too hard to implement in a good way, there's plenty of other pedagogies out there for you to choose from that you can use to enhance it. Do we have any other questions in the chat?
No other questions so far, but thank you, Laura, for asking that question. That was a great question.
Okay, so I turn it over to you, Amy, to start getting things started for our breakout sessions.
Sure. All right. So we do have quite a few participants in here today. We have 83 participants. What Rachel and I are going to do is split you out into breakout rooms. Don't groan. It's going to be fun, I promise. We're going to put you in about 8 people will be in each room. And what we ask you to do is just introduce yourself to your colleagues. We're still in this weird pandemic situation where we're online, so it's good to make connections with the folks in your group. And then what we'll do is give you a list of discussion questions. And in the chat right now, I'm actually going to go ahead and provide that link so that you have those guided group exercise discussion questions. And just keep in mind that you don't have to go through each of those discussion questions. They're just there more as an opportunity for you after the session to be able to do this on your own as well. But they will help guide you through this exercise with your group. And then lastly, what you're going to do is make a Google slide incorporating your answers from some of those discussion questions. And what we'd like you to do is pick one speaker in your group who is very brave and would like to speak potentially to the rest of the group when we come back together. So with the link that I sent you, you'll notice that there are some discussion questions there. What we'd like you to do is answer a couple of them, especially this first one. What you want to do is pick out a pedagogical theory that you've been interested in trying in your classroom. And if you're not sure which theories you want to try, we have a list there of some examples for you. We've also added a link there so that you can skip the overview piece. We've already kind of done some of the Googling for you for some of the theories that we have listed as examples. And so as you're doing this, feel free to use that document to help guide you as well. All right. So yes, with that link I gave you, all of the instructions are there. I'm going to go ahead and assign the breakout rooms. Does anybody have any questions before I do that?
Yes.
Yes.
You said we're supposed to be working with the theory. Are you guys assigning a theory to the groups, or are we choosing our own theory? And if so, where do we get the theories?
Sure. Great question. Your group can decide on one of the theories we provided as an example within that link I just put into the chat, or you can choose another theory that is of interest to the whole group, your small group.
And embedded in the doc for each, there's a link to another doc. So for each of the suggested theories, we've linked to at least one like website or short article where people could go and read a little bit about the theory, so that you don't have to flail around trying to learn a little bit about a theory. And if you guys can't agree, well, maybe Amy and I will pop in and we'll assign you one if that's what you want us to do.
All right. Everyone ready to get into their breakout rooms? All right, here we go.